Hi, my name is Marisol Cassis. I live in Leola, Pennsylvania. I've been attending Calvary since about 2015, and I'm married to my husband, Will. I have two daughters, Naomi, who is 5, and Rachel, who is soon to be 2 years old. I'm a stay-at-home mom, but I was a former math teacher for middle school and high school. And I grew up in South Jersey. I was actually adopted when I was 3 months old from Bogota, Colombia. And I grew up in a family that went to church, but I wouldn't say most of my life we were a Christian household. I definitely had a lot of time at church, Sunday school, vacation Bible school, many volunteer type things. But for the longest time, I believe that I lacked the foundation of the word of the Lord. Which brings me to the passage that I'm excited to talk with you all about. And the passage today is Matthew 7, verses 24 to 27. And this is when Jesus is finishing up his Sermon on the Mount, and he is giving a parable about a wise and a foolish man. And it's interesting because this is the last parable that he gives before he finishes this very well-known sermon. The reason why I chose this parable is because I've had 2 major storms in my life that have shaped and helped define my walk with the Lord. The first one is when my father was diagnosed in 2007 with lung cancer. So I had just started my freshman year of college away at Millersville University, and I wasn't really sure what was going to happen, and I kind of went about my own way, and I relied on my friends, I relied on partying. And once he passed away of April of 2008, I relied even more heavily on that kind of lifestyle. I was in an ungodly relationship, and I was consumed by the things of this world instead of being consumed with Jesus. And I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know what to do with what I was faced with in losing my father to lung cancer. So Jesus talks about the wise and the foolish man. So in that time, I definitely would deem myself the foolish man. And once we read the passage, it'll make a little more sense to you. A few years later, I decided to walk away from the ungodly relationship that I was involved in because I knew that it was keeping me from truly surrendering to the Lord. And about 6 months after that, 5 or 6 months, my mom passed away suddenly. So although I had walked away from this relationship, I was on my knees praying and diving into God's word like I never had before from the breakup that I had just been involved in. And I was so close to the Lord that time actually was really valuable when my mom passed, because I had a firm foundation, and I had this applied knowledge now, the wisdom to rely on Jesus in this second storm of my life. So let's go ahead and read Matthew 7, verses 24 to 27. It's a very small passage, but it has a lot of power to it. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And it fell, and great was the fall of it. So if you heard, there's a lot of contrast and comparisons in this small yet very powerful passage and parable that Jesus is talking about. So let's begin with what both builders and houses have in common. Firstly, they both hear the word of the Lord. They both hear the words of Jesus. Secondly, they both are building a house. They're building a foundation, a life, something for the future. Third, and most importantly, they both endure a storm. Now, there was rain, there was flooding, and there was severe wind, because it says it beat on that house. It wasn't a gentle breeze. The wind was beating on each of the houses. So when my dad was diagnosed with lung cancer, and I wasn't really sure what to make of that, and this is the first time I was truly being tested in my trust in the Lord, I found a verse in the Gospel of John, and I'll read it for you because it has become my life verse. It's John 16:33, and I'll focus on the second part of it. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So when I was facing the storm of my dad having cancer and the uncertainty of it, I relied on this verse, but I still didn't necessarily have the foundation to trust the Lord with this storm, or to comfort me the way that I should be comforted and not in the ways of the world. So, to tie it back in, John 16:33, Jesus promises that there will be tribulation in this world, in our life. That's where they both have in common the storm. Now, let's compare and contrast the scenarios of each, the foolish and the wise man. Starting with the foolish man, starting with the wise man, it's saying that this wise man built his house on the rock. And what that means is Jesus says, whoever does the words of mine, whoever does them. So in James 1, verses 22 to 25, we are encouraged and exhorted to not only be hearers of the word, deceiving ourselves, but doers. And it's not alluding to any kind of legalistic lifestyle. It is encouraging us to be doers of this law of liberty and this perfect law. Another biblical reference about being doers of the word is in Psalm 1, verses 1 through 4, and how we delight in the law of the Lord day and night. And we are like a tree when we're in the word of the Lord that is planted by a stream, being nourished and growing, bearing fruit in its own season. We are being nourished by the living water of Jesus in the word of the Lord. So it says in Matthew 7 that the house stood of the wise man because it had been founded on the rock in verse 25. The rock being Jesus' words, God's son. Now, in contrast, we have the foolish man, and his house is being built on sand. So, what is the difference? He is not doing the words of the Lord, and it fell in verse 27, and great was the fall of it. So let's just think about this as far as comparing. We have a house built on the rock. That's the person that does the words of the Lord, or will do the word of the Lord, not just be hearers. And then we have the sand foundation, and that is hearing the word of the Lord, but not doing them and being deceived. During the storm that they both encountered, the wise man's house stood because it was founded on the rock. The foolish man's house fell, and great was the fall. So there's a lot of contrast there. And the biggest contrast that I want to say is that in the wise man's scenario, there's hope. Yes, there was a storm. It was severe. There was flooding. There was severe wind, and it was enduring a lot, but there was hope in it. In contrast, in the case of the foolish man's house, it was founded on sand. It did not endure the storm, and great was the fall. It says in verse 27 again. And there was loss. So there was no hope, but there was tremendous loss. So my main takeaway, firstly, is to recall John 16:33, in that this is true that there will be storms and tribulation for both scenarios, whether we're being wise and having a foundation of the rock of Jesus, or when we're being foolish and not having that foundation, not being doers of the word. So we're either open and receiving and obeying, or rejecting. There's two differences, and we are, whether we know it or not, choosing one of them in our lives. But that we can seek the Lord. And what does that mean? It means reading and following his word, praying about it with an open heart, humbling ourselves in the sight of the Lord, so that when the storm does come, we can have peace in Jesus, as the first part of John 16:33 says, and we can have hope in him, like we see with the storm that occurs in the wise man's on the wise man's house, that although there was a storm, it endured and it stood because it was founded on the rock. And all the glory is given to God for that in the end. So for me, the difference between my father's passing away and mourning that loss and my mother's passing is that although my mom was very dear to me and the loss was sudden and traumatic and tragic, I still had the hope of Jesus because I had been diving into God's word and I had been seeking him with all of my heart, and I had given up things that he had asked me to give up that were against him. And so I just encourage you, wherever you are in your walk, to seek the Lord, draw near to him, and he will draw near to you. That's a call and a promise from the book of James. Well, thank you so much for letting me share this with you, and I hope you all have a blessed week.